Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be in the world. Thanks for joining us today. And I'm glad to present again Jeanne Liedtka, that last year, in January was it last year, she presented the first version of insights that she collected or got to after 50 plus deep assessments through teams in enterprises, governments, NGOs, large bureaucracies, as she likes to call them. And she deconstructed what design thinking means to all these people, right? And she talks about design thinking as a social technology to enable system-wide change, right? And I recommend that you check in our webinar section and review that presentation at some other time with a cup of coffee. Right, so back then, in addition to inspiring us and enlightening us, she made a promise, right? And then today she's going to be fulfilling that promise. She's all of that questions and answers that she got. She worked with Christina to package them up in an instrument, a survey, to allow for self-assessment, so that we can now open up to more people to provide their input and see what are the results and compare to the rest of the world, basically, in practicing design thinking. So welcome everybody that's participating today. Saying hi from Dublin, Seattle, Hollywood, California, British Columbia, all over the world, it seems. Today, we are going to be opening up and become guinea pigs of this experiment. And we're going to be telling more on that. So Jeanne, Christina, thanks for joining us today. I look forward to upgrading my brain and everybody's brain on your new thinking. And everybody joining us, in order to make the most out of this hour, I asked Jeanne to share a little bit of the latest and greatest of her thinking. And then, but most of the time we'll be doing something around Q&A, right? So she'll be opening up the survey, and I want you guys to get your questions in the Q&A panel of the Zoom app, and I'll be curating them and asking Jeanne and Christina to give us more information. All right. So, yeah, sorry. Okay, so Jeanne, please go ahead. I'm having some audio trouble, so please go ahead and open up.
Great, thank you, Mariano. It's great to be here with everyone again. It is a very special day in Charlottesville. If you don't know, all our Wahoo Wah fans, our college men's basketball team last night, for the first time in its history, won the NCAA finals. For those of you outside of the US who don't get that whole NCAA thing, it's like our World Cup, only it happens once a year instead of every 4 years. So go Virginia, you've caught us on a great day. And talking about our favorite subject, design thinking. In particular, this area of measurement. And as Mariano said, we talked, it's been over a year now, last January, around some work that we were doing based on our research around design thinking. And in particular, based on our 10 years worth of study of these cases of design thinking being used in a variety of different large organizations, and talking about what we were learning about the kind of impact design thinking was having on many levels. One of the things I'll do today is very quickly review a little of that and then move to the next step, where Christina and I have been working together to create an instrument that we're looking forward to sharing with you today and getting your feedback on, that we think may allow us to take the next step into this world of measurement. Of course, we live in a world, most of us, that truly believes that you can only manage what you can measure. Right? And there are challenges like that associated with design thinking. Now, there's been some really good new work over the last year on the subject of measurement and design thinking that I would suggest you check out if you haven't already. Last February, the Forrester folks published a report on their study of IBM's design thinking teams, comparing them to client teams that were not using design thinking and found some pretty incredible results. Even though their sample was small, they were looking at over 300% return on IBM's investment in the 3-year period they studied. So quite dramatic. More recently, McKinsey has published a study called The Business Value of Design that looks at a very comprehensive database, over 300 publicly listed organizations, looking at 5 years worth of data, and then sorting them into quartiles depending upon the extent of their use of design and design thinking. They found equally remarkable results. They were looking at revenues in the top quartile firms using design and design thinking to be 32% higher. Returns to shareholders saw an even bigger boost. So we're seeing some of this exciting new work really starting to put some numbers, some quantitative research around what these impacts of design thinking are. Our approach has been a little bit different, and I'd like to talk about why. One of the things we know, one of the challenges of measuring the impact of design thinking is it is very complicated, right? So many of the benefits of this human-centered approach have the messy complexity of human beings in them. So what we see is when we look at these hard measures of design thinking outcomes, we really are only touching the tip of an iceberg, what's showing above the water. We know from our 10 years of research that some of the most profound and transformational impacts of the use of the design thinking methodology happen below the surface and are harder to see. But these are things like changes in the conversation, changes in the way people see the world, changes in how people think. How do we put numbers around those? That's been our challenge as we think about it. So that's what I'd like to talk a little about today. Our belief is that the way we put numbers around those is to recognize that design thinking is actually a bundle of different approaches, and that we have to deconstruct that bundle in order to materially be able to get our arms around some of these more subtle, human-centered, but equally powerful outcomes of design thinking. So let me talk a little bit about why we believe that deconstructing design thinking is important. Well, first of all, when we deconstruct design thinking into its key elements and then look at the impacts of those elements, it allows us to tie design thinking to actual human behaviors rather than merely financial flows. We know from our work that design thinking, as Mariano said, it's a social technology. It is a psychological process that transforms the innovator as much as it transforms the experience of those they're innovating for. Our hypothesis is that unless we do that kind of transformational work, we really don't see the key benefits of design thinking. So in order to produce those financial numbers down the road that we like so much, we have to back up and we have to understand how design thinking is changing the day-to-day practices of actual human beings working with the tools in their organization. So that's a big impetus for our work. I think the second thing that deconstructing design thinking lets us do is it lets us be hypothesis-driven, which after all is what design is about. Too often, we try and take the metrics we've already got and use them to demonstrate impact. If you do that, you will miss many of the benefits that design thinking confers. There's a joke that I've told lately for me that I get frustrated when people talk exclusively about the financial flows of design thinking as though that's its major impact. To me, talking about design thinking's impact as being about financial flows is like talking about Viagra in its original conception as a way to lower people's blood pressure, right? That may be our intention, but that focus completely misses the most powerful benefits. So we want to be hypothesis-driven. We want to figure out what we need to measure. And then we have to go and often construct measures to do that. Third reason, I think most of us who have grown fond of design thinking and spend a lot of time thinking about how to do it well worry that one of the casualties of its popularity will be that a lot of people will do it badly. This is the tendency of all organizations. This isn't unique to design thinking. In any new initiative, we can pretty much guarantee that a lot of organizations will take these new tools, teach them very superficially, not surround them with the infrastructure they need to succeed, and in fact, give design thinking a bad name, not because it isn't a powerful tool, but because they've done it poorly. Unless we go to the behavioral level, I don't think we can help people understand what design thinking done deeply and well looks like, rather than design thinking done shallowly and superficially. Yes, we know you can go out and do a couple of ethnographic interviews. That doesn't guarantee the kind of experience of immersion in the lives of the people we're trying to serve that produces empathy, that triggers so many of the powerful behavioral impacts of design thinking. So looking at behaviors lets us begin to specify what good design thinking in practice looks like in enough detail that we can actually begin to manage those practices. Fourth, I think because we so often have to construct new measures to demonstrate the impact of design thinking, we have to think about pre-test, post-test if we want powerful measures. And thinking pre-test, post-test means we have to think about measuring before we actually begin to act in the design thinking project. So again, deconstructing lets us move this question of measurement from something that you do after you're finished to something you think about right at the beginning of the process. And then finally, one more argument for deconstruction, and maybe it's one that Christina and I as academics are particularly fond to. There are decades of existing research in psychology and sociology that talk about why the behaviors design thinking encourages are so important. For instance, we can look at research on cognition and good decision making and go back to people like Kahneman and Tversky, who've demonstrated time and time again that hypothesis confirmation bias is one of the most serious problems in decision making. Right? Well, design thinking, with its emphasis on testing, on surfacing assumptions, on thinking explicitly about how we see disconfirming data, works on improving our ability to be good hypothesis testers. We don't need to demonstrate that becoming good hypothesis testers is valuable. Cognitive scientists demonstrated that 50 years ago. Right? So let's begin to tie into that as part of understanding at a behavioral level why design thinking works. So what would that actually look like? Well, it would begin by saying, what are the different elements of design thinking? In our research, there are 5 critical elements that we see that are characteristic of these firms that we've looked at, who are experiencing success using a deep design thinking practice. I think these would be familiar to everyone in the audience. Obviously, we begin with the understanding of user context and needs. We talk about the role of bringing in diverse perspectives, the value of dialogue-based conversations, the whole notion of experimentation, creating a portfolio of solutions and then winnowing these through actual data from the marketplace. And then finally, and one of the things that we've spent a lot of time thinking and writing about at Darden, is the way in which it provides an infrastructure that makes the use of the design thinking tools feel safe to those of us who've grown up in large, pretty bureaucratic organizations, learning a very different toolkit. The next step then would be to take each of these practices and unpack the behaviors that those unleash, and then look at how those behaviors in turn would produce outcomes. So I'll just give you a quick for instance on the first element, which is around the deep understanding of user needs. Well, what are the specific behavioral outcomes that produces? Well, one, it allows us to develop user-driven criteria for ideation, which means we produce better choices. We reduce the risk of failure. We increase the likelihood of implementation, a whole set of positive outcomes. At the same time, we know another key element is behaviorally helping us to reframe the problem itself. We know how much potential innovation is lost at the outset because of conventional definitions of the problem. Aligning team members, I think, is one of the less recognized, but in my past life as a strategist, one of the most critical tools that design thinking brings. Right? We know we can come up with great ideas. If we can't align a broader audience around them to make them real, all of those great ideas help us for nothing. That brings in issues like emotional engagement. This deep ethnographic work grabs us. It makes us care. And desire is a much more powerful motivator of change than setting goals. So we can do this same activity for each of the elements of design thinking. We can look at the way having heterogeneous teams and bringing diverse perspectives has a set of positive outcomes around expanding repertoire, broadening access to networks, enhancing people's willingness to co-create. We could look at dialogue in particular and the power of dialogue to drive engagement and trust building in groups, to allow emergence, unique solutions that are better than anyone brought into the room that emerge during dialogue-based conversations. Similarly, we can look at this idea of having multiple solutions and then winnowing them via small bets, and the way in which that allows us to reduce cognitive bias, allow champions to emerge as part of the testing process, encourages learning, reduces the costs of failure. And then finally, looking at this idea of the creation of structured facilitative process, we can look at how it helps us to manage the cognitive complexity of innovating amid the high uncertainty and ambiguity that so often characterize work in this area. So what we've done then is we've taken all of these behaviors, unpacked, and repack them into a diagnostic instrument that Christina and I have created that we believe will begin to provide a simple, straightforward tool for helping us to assess how design thinking is adding value today in our organizations. So we'd like to invite you now to work with us on this tool. We've provided a link that will allow you to go in and take this survey. We encourage you to share it with other people. Let me talk a little bit about what it will look like. As you open up the survey, you'll see that the first thing we're asking about is the particular design thinking practices that you are using. One of the critical ways to help us manage design thinking more effectively and demonstrate outcomes is to bring some clarity to this kind of messy bundle of stuff that people are calling design thinking. For instance, one of the things that we're discovering is so often what we're calling design thinking is actually mostly front-end ethnography and idea generation. The power of the back-end testing process is not being used nearly to the extent that we believe it should. So we hope that by querying you about the specific practices, we'll be able to begin to link specific outcomes with specific practices to help you think about what portfolio of design thinking tools is best for the environment you're operating in and the kinds of problems you're trying to solve. Once we've queried you in particular about your tools, and here again, reminder, we're just asking you to talk about in your own cumulative experience working with design thinking, to what extent you have never versus pretty much always used this kind of different range of tools. Having asked you about that, we're now going to go to outcomes. And again, in the outcome section, what we're trying to understand, what we're trying to calibrate is to what extent you, again, cumulatively looking across all of your experiences, working with design thinking, the different kinds of outcomes that you observe. Again, from I've never observed that particular outcome to I have almost always observed that particular outcome. So what this will allow us to do then is get a sense of specifically what is being used under the name of design thinking and what impacts that is having in organizations. So that's the tool. I'll talk a little bit more towards the end of the webinar about how Christina and I foresee using that tool and our plans around how we're going to work with you and allow you to gain access to what we're learning, and in particular to your own results. But for now, I think, Mariano, we were going to open the floor up to some Q&A and see what people would like to talk about.
Yep. So I'll start with some more logistical ones, because Jason Dyer here is asking, is the survey intended to be done at a team level, or organization level? How do you think of that? Because you talk about like doing like an assessment also like longitudinally, right? So like, how do you think of folks should address this?
Well, once we validated the instrument, and that's the process that Christina and I are working on now, demonstrating that it is a valid instrument and a good way to go, we foresee lots of uses for this kind of instrument. So for instance, as Mariano suggested, it might be a very useful instrument for a team to take as a kind of a pre-test, post-test. So a team might take the instrument and look at the extent to which they're doing things like focusing on the user, sharing, becoming aligned, and things like that, and then look at the end and see to what extent things have changed. So I think there's lots of different uses. We envisioned it originally being filled out by individuals, but certainly it could be filled out by teams as we work with it as next level. It certainly could be filled out through the perspective of an organization and what that looked like. But I think in this first pass, and I'll invite Christina to say a few words about that as well. I think in this first pass, we would like you to fill it out as an individual from your own personal perspective, really probably having been involved in multiple teams using design thinking. Is that about right, Christina? What do you think?
Yeah, so we envision it being used in applied research. In other words, organizations in the field using it. As we know, a lot of organizations are investing a good amount of money and energy into making this method part of the culture of the organization, and I'm sure they would like to know if it's making a difference and if it's producing the results and outcomes that they're looking for. From our standpoint, and this initial phase that we're at, is we really need to first establish how well that measure actually measures those 5 practices that Jeanne talked about and those mechanisms through which the outcomes can be achieved. So at this stage, we really, really need your help trying us to make that instrument a really solid one. In other words, saying, if you as an organization in the future want to use this instrument, you will know that what it captures is major practices and mechanisms through which design thinking would produce the outcomes that you would want for it to produce. So 2 uses, applied research as well as basic research, because eventually we would like to show at a scholarly level that yes, method makes a difference. And if we were looking at basic research, that would require thousands of responses and really large samples for us to be able to show that. And ideally, you can look at it from the team standpoint and use teams as units of analysis, or you can ask individual employees or participants to take it on at the individual level. So it can be done at many different levels and for numerous purposes.
I think the other thing I'd point out is that there are some open-ended questions at the end of the instrument. For instance, we may have missed things. You may see positive outcomes in your experience of design thinking that we don't list anywhere in the instrument, in which case we'd invite you to share those positive outcomes with us. We're also interested in negative outcomes. Something that we haven't talked much about in general is, what are the downsides of design thinking? What are the pitfalls that we should be looking to avoid? So there's an open-ended question asking you to share your negative outcomes that you've seen as a result of using design thinking. So again, we're inviting you to be an experimenter with us as we learn more and develop what we hope will be a very easy to use, straightforward, but effective tool for you to use in your organization.
Well, so that leads me to a question by Joe Reifer, and he says like that design thinking, one of the problems that he sees is the lack of follow-up after a group activity. And I think that sometimes people think of design thinking equals workshop, maybe something that you mentioned before. And again, lots of people want to participate, but accountability is an issue for the now what happens after the session. So it seems like the comment that you mentioned before, like, okay, design thinking equals like, innovation theater and being in a room. That's something that is common in your practice. Have you seen a lot of stories of not going all the way to the back end, making it, shoot back people?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that troubles me greatly is the hackathon mentality, right? We're going to have a one-day hackathon of design thinking. And I mean, the one day, get everyone excited, aware of the tools, do lots of brainstorming, things like that. That's great and fun and has its role. But what I see is organizations actually thinking they've introduced design thinking after a one-day hackathon experience, right? Well, that's crazy. We know that. But how do we demonstrate just how crazy that is? What we hope this instrument will let us do is say, look, if all you're doing with design thinking is you're out brainstorming stuff, right? You haven't done deep ethnography to start with. You haven't followed it up with in-market experiments. You haven't co-created with the people you're designing for. Well, if all you've done is brainstorm and you've called that design thinking, you're not going to see much in the way of results, right? And so as much as that is obvious to those of us working with design thinking, I am consistently shocked at organizations who know what good training and development of their people look like, and who ask me to come in and do a one-day workshop on design thinking and then expect people to embed design thinking tools in their practices. We need to be able to get our hands around some data that demonstrates what we all know to be true, which is to have transformational effects, you have to implement design thinking comprehensively as an end-to-end process that has both idea generation and idea testing, right? Done rigorously by people who've been well-trained. And I think this instrument is one way to do that. Otherwise, we'll have lots of people with one day of training doing this badly, not getting the kind of results that we know design thinking can produce, and then organizations writing it off because we tried that, it didn't work, it didn't give us outcomes.
So, yeah.
Can I add to what Jeanne was saying?
Please go ahead.
So I was following the chat box and writing some things down. A lot of people have talked about design thinking is not just a workshop. It's a process, it's a mindset. And I think that if people took a look at our instrument and they saw what is captured in it, in many ways it can almost be used as a diagnostic tool or something that people can look at and go, okay, this is what I should be looking for to happen as we go through the process. If it's not happening, maybe I'm not following the entire process in a way that it should be followed. Maybe I'm skipping at the beginning. And to that point, it's really interesting because my work is in nonprofit space and social service space. And what I see in my constituent base is that people they don't want to spend a lot of time at the beginning phase empathizing with stakeholders and clients. They just want to rush through straight to the prototyping phase. And if that's the case, again, like what Dr. Liedtka was saying, are we doing it right? If we just rush through the process and if we're not aware of those milestones or those behavioral changes that we would like to see at the team level, individual level, and organizational cultural level, what good are we doing by introducing yet another sprint or another workshop? It's like, I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, and there isn't a day that goes by without me getting an announcement about a workshop, a sprint of some sort, or a webinar or a seminar. Everyone seems to be doing it and everyone seems to be fascinated by it. And I think that unless we take some measures and say, here's what should be happening, if we do it right, there's a danger that it will get a bad reputation and that it will go as a method that was a fad and it never established itself.
I agree. In particular, what we're seeing a lot in our research is any kind of rigorous experimentation is not happening. Any kind of rigorous attempts at measurement of impact are not happening. That's not really surprising to me. I think most people who are drawn to design thinking are human-centered people. They do it because they like improving the lives and experiences of other people. When you've done something like that, you can see the improvement in their lives. You can feel it. They don't want to slow themselves down by hanging around and trying to do a pre-test, post-test measurement to demonstrate it. They know it's there. So they go on to the next design thinking project. Well, the problem with that is we never collect the data then that allows us to show more skeptical people or organizations making investment decisions what the payoff is. So again, we've developed, at Darden, we've spent a lot of our time trying to develop a simple, teachable, scalable process that people who were not originally trained as designers can use to implement design thinking. The next step is to create a simple, scalable, easily trainable process by which these same people can think about demonstrating outcomes, because I don't think it comes naturally to many of us who are most interested in doing design thinking.
So Jeanne, one of the impacts that I like the most about the deployment of design thinking is like the increased likelihood of successful implementation, right? And Stephen Riley here asking about like, okay, has design thinking helped in change digital transformation or change the culture of a company? Can you share a little story on again, when a group of leaders that were either agnostic or didn't believe in this thing came into a little step in the design thinking process and helped rally behind the initiative around cultural change, not necessarily around like one product or service out there?
I think there are many stories of that in our research, Mariano. One of my very favorites comes from my friends at Monash University Medical Center in Melbourne, Australia, where a group of physicians and administrators are leading an incredibly powerful grounds up design thinking implementation. One of the cases we studied there was around the psychiatric walk-in clinic. So these are people who are walking into their emergency room in acute psychiatric distress. There's often been a drug overdose. There's been a suicide attempt. Clinicians care passionately about helping these people, but what they see in their data is their impact is going the wrong way. The interval between these patients showing up in the emergency room, instead of lengthening, is getting shorter and shorter and shorter, so that they know that their current method of treating them is absolutely not working. Unfortunately, every group of people involved in the treatment of those patients has a different idea around how best to treat them. This is what we see with diverse groups, right? We bring a group of people together who come from different functions, different perspectives, different skill bases, and we know that within that diversity lies the hope of a better solution than any one of them could create. But often we can't get to that because the diversity overwhelms us, turns into conflict, and paralysis happens. So this is what was happening at Monash. Despite repeated committees formed, looking at the issues, lots of conversation, they could never agree on how to fix the situation. Until one of the heads of the clinic who was familiar with journey mapping, decided to use kind of deep ethnographic methodology to try and understand the actual experience of the patients that were coming into the emergency room. So working with medical records from 3 different systems, she put together the journey of a series of patients. One of whom became really kind of symbolic was Tom. Tom had had over 70 different interactions in his various visits to the emergency room. What they all realized as they came together and looked at Tom's experience was that what was missing to help him feel better and be able to lead a more normal life was not medical intervention. It was someone who cared about him and could work with Tom throughout the process. That recognition completely changed the way the clinicians saw the experience. As one of them described, how shocked she was at how badly this system they had designed that they had hoped would help Tom was really hurting him. That's what unleashed the emotional engagement for the specialties to let go of their solutions and to align around this prime criteria of how to create a system in which Tom knows he is cared for throughout the process. It unleashed an ability to work together that they had been trying and failing at for years. The new system was implemented immediately because it had the buy-in of all of the different specialties involved. And it has produced amazing improvements for people like Tom. So that's just one story of the many that we could talk about from our research, Mariano, in which in the background of improved solutions are fundamental changes in the kinds of conversations people are having internally and the impact of those changes on their engagement, their alignment, their ownership of the solution, their willingness to implement the solution. That's where the gold is in this co-creation work we're looking at.
So yeah, that's, I mean, stories and stories from the ground seem to be something good. We're trying to complement those stories, right, with some research here, or at least, I mean, talking points from your research, right? Like some of the questions that you have in your assessment should help people reflect on those things too. Sometimes you don't think about it that way. And when I went through the survey, I said, okay, interesting. I have not thought of work in that way. So I recommend that everybody online go take a look at the survey. Going through it also helps you like get to talking points and tidbits that you can use in your own storytelling and your own presentations.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we'd like to do is to get people to use a design thinking approach to measuring the impact of design thinking, right? We've got a mental model about measurements, right? They have to be quantitative. They have to relate to financials. There's a box called what it means to measure something. We've got to reframe that as we look to really capture. If we don't reframe it, if we accept all of the traditional thinking about measurement, I don't believe we'll ever be able to come close to demonstrating the true transformational power of design thinking as a method.
So Jeanne, talking about that transformational power, so Liam Friedland is talking about how to convince leaders. And you mentioned before that at Darden you had like a series of steps there. Would you repeat that again? I think it's worth it for the audience to acknowledge that and again, and see how you teach others trying to make those transformations happen.
Well, what we've discovered now, having taught design thinking for over 10 years, is that designers don't need a lot of structure to learn it, but almost everybody else does. And it's paradoxical. I mean, we think we've developed an artificially linear process to help guide people through the learning of design thinking. It's a 15-step process. It comes with templates for people to fill out. All these things that we think of as antithetical to creativity, right? How can a template help me be more creative? How can a 15-step process unleash my ability to innovate? But it does, because fear is the biggest impediment. One of the things that we've learned in our work is that everyone at every level of an organization is capable of being an innovator and thinking creatively about how to take the people they serve at whatever level they serve people and find ways to improve their experience and enrich their lives. But doing that means stepping into something that makes most of us highly uncomfortable. Whether it's a business person, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a nurse or physician, whether it's an engineer, we've been trained in highly analytical methods. And so when you tell us to go and do ethnography, or you tell us to brainstorm, or any of these things, we don't have a lot of confidence in ourselves that we're doing it right. And what we found is if you give people structure, even online, I mean, one of the things that has been very encouraging to me as an educator is a lot of material that I would traditionally teach as an educator. I'm a strategist by training. I teach a lot of leadership. Strategy and leadership are very difficult to teach in an online environment, in my experience. But it turns out that design thinking is made for online. Why? Because it's essentially project-based. We only learn it when we do it. And online allows you to, step by step, deliver just-in-time learning that someone can apply to their project in that moment. And so I'm very encouraged by the ability to take this seemingly illogical thing called structure and use it to kind of free us from the fear that keeps us from finding the innovator that lives inside everyone we know.
And if I can add to that, how do you sell this to the leaders or executive directors? And what I found in my past research on innovation, and I developed a measure to capture how innovative organizations were, I found that during my interviews with the executive directors, as we would go through these questions on different types of innovations, they would go, I have never really thought of doing this. So it served as an instrument, as a way to reflect on their current practices. And if you had a leader or executive director take this, look at this instrument and go, wow, these would be the changes that I would see in my organization if my team or the entire organization went through the process. I think it would be pretty eye-opening, because you hear now it's like, oh, you know, design thinking is just a bunch of tools, but a bunch of different stages. But if you started with this end point in mind, what would happen if I went through this process and if it was done right? I don't think there would be much convincing that would have to happen. The method and the process would start selling itself, because there's true lack of clarity on people's mind on what it is that this method accomplishes differently than some other method. I get these questions all the time. Well, how is this different from entrepreneurship? How is this different from social entrepreneurship? And then you start explaining, and then you see blank faces, and you can tell they shut down because they don't really see the value or the difference between this method and what else is on the market. And I think looking at those deep behavioral changes and organizational changes could be a strong selling point.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's why I like, I mean, the unbundling, right? Because I mean, design thinking, lean startup, and agile, all big words that are packaging, again, core practices. And as Jeanne said, like hypothesis testing is a core best practice of design thinking. But I would argue it applies to all of the other practice, right? So like it's hard sometimes when the Zoom level is so high, and what you guys done on bringing it down, and hopefully more of the audience can build up to that, so that we don't talk about like design thinking here, but talk about like the practices of like ethnography and feeling a pain point from a customer perspective and prototyping fast. Those two things, as I said, are really easy for having even in a session done, and get a lot of insight coming from a lot of people participating there.
Exactly. And, you know, when we talk to senior leaders, I mean, we're not going to go and ask them to, you know, implement design thinking in an organization-wide scale. We're asking for the ability to conduct experiments, I think. And again, I think that it is very difficult to abstractly argue with someone about the merits of design thinking when they have not experienced the use of design thinking. So I think what we're arguing with is this new data we have from people like McKinsey and Forrester that says, look, we've done some pretty big quantitative studies. There's something here, combined with stories from other organizations like us demonstrating how it's helped them. And then finally, the idea that let's identify a couple of experiments, a couple of projects we think would work for us so that we can experience it and then take that learning and scale it up if it makes sense. So again, I think we're looking at a progressive series of arguments. forcing design thinking into an organization from the top down, based on arguing for its return on investment, I don't think it would work, even if you could pull it off.
So I have two more questions before I let you guys wrap up. And one is, on the downside, right? So like Brendan Raftery asking, what are the dangers of everybody practicing design thinking, everybody being a designer? There's sometimes designers say that, the situation is like, you give design thinking a bad name, right? Or design a bad name. How would you counter that? In general, what I say is like, we all started playing guitar horribly and we end up getting better, right?
Exactly.
So again, how do you reply to designers? I know you bring designers into your MBA programs. Mm-hmm. What is the thing about designers not liking others being design thinkers?
And I understand exactly what troubles designers. It's design done badly, right? And certainly, I think it's very important to talk about the difference between equipping someone with design thinking tools and thinking you've turned someone into a designer with the kind of ability to design the kind of products and stuff that real designers who've been schooled in tools like visualization and user interface interaction have, right? So I think at some level, I think your music analogy is exactly on, Mariano. We don't want to deprive people of the pleasures of learning to play music because they're not Chopin. We don't want to tell people that they can't play tennis at all unless, they can become Federer. We have to recognize that there are different levels of progression, but that there is value for everyone to learn these basic tools. And I believe that design thinking tools represent a basic managerial competency for the future. That if we can't equip everyone in an organization with the ability to innovate in their own world, whatever the boundaries of that world may be, we will not survive amid the accelerating uncertainty and ambiguity and pressures of globalization and all of the stuff going on around us, right? But we do need to understand that we need designers for a set of more sophisticated tasks. It's no different than total quality management, right? We always have quality experts, right?
Yeah, data science, data awareness, being confident how to use data to make decisions, right? Same situation. I'm not a data scientist, but
exactly. So I don't think that's the grounds for not introducing it. I do, however, think that we need to think carefully about who should be solving what problems. And where you have people who are new to the methodology, don't have deep training, trying to solve problems that are beyond their ability to solve and probably beyond the skill set at all, that's a problem. So again, this idea of design thinking as good for anything we want to do in organizations is in itself a problem. Design thinking is good for a particular kind of problem, and it can be addressed at different levels by different levels of skill. We need to get a lot more sophisticated in helping organizations think that through.
And wrapping up the analogy, I think that once you know how to play a few chords, you start to appreciate more than the other guy that can do the full thing is the expert, and you want to bring him in and have like a common language and a way to again, appreciate more the work, but also remember people. One of the observations that the ladies found in the research is that bringing people through the process, non-designers through the process, increases the likelihood of successful implementation. That means that they can bring in more funds, they can hire more designers, they can leave you with more time and power to implement the ideas.
Absolutely.
So we are 10 minutes to the hour. So I'm gonna let you guys wrap this up with again, some action items. And most importantly, Jeanne, also, I'm curious to know, again, for the folks that want to convince their leaders, take them to the 15-step process, how do you get started? Is there something that you have easy for them to get started with?
Absolutely. Let me talk a little bit about next steps, and then I'll wrap up with some suggestions based on what we've been doing at Darden. How might we use this new instrument? Once, as Christina says, we've got it validated, we're sure it's testing the right things, we're getting good data. I think we can use it in a couple of ways. One is something Mariano suggested. What we've tried to capture in that instrument is the whole universe of positive outcomes that we've seen in 10 years of research design thinking produce, right? In exposing people to that universe, our hope is they will begin to see possibilities for design thinking that are much broader than what they've been thinking about. So we begin to think beyond design thinking is great for designing new products and services. Two, design thinking is a great way for teams to build alignment, to build champions for implementation, all kinds of things. So I think that idea of let's specify what the whole universe of opportunities looks like as we talk about design thinking. Secondly, I think it's this idea of let's understand where we're currently performing well so that we can tell that story, right? As we look through it, let's find out where the impacts, where we're circling a lot of almost always at that end, right? We are seeing this as a powerful impact, right? Now, how do we tell that story to people? Where's the data to prove that, right? What do people care about who are the recipients of the messages of impact that we're trying to make? Once we know what story we've got to tell, we can figure out powerful ways to tell that story. Conversely, we can also identify where we're missing opportunities for impact. Every element of that instrument contains something that an organization has benefited already from. So all of those elements are things that we know design thinking can produce. If they're not producing them in your experience, then the question is why? Is it because you're using design thinking too superficially? Is it because you're using only certain parts of the process and not using the process comprehensively? Is it because you're not attacking the right kinds of problems, or you're not working with the right other groups in your organizations? By beginning to identify the benefits you're missing, I think it allows you to begin a self-examination of, in order to move our program forward, what do we need to be doing differently? And then finally, I myself am very intrigued by the pre-test, post-test notion. I don't think any design thinking project should begin without the design brief right up front, identifying the outcomes we're trying to produce and the metrics that we would use today to know they were working, so that we can get measures before we go out into the field and begin to do our design work, right? And again, when we talk about measurement, we're always looking for this kind of giant ROI pie in the sky thing. I think oftentimes the most powerful measures are specific to the project, right? Now you can take specific project measures and put money on them. I think, again, Forrester's report is a great example of how to monetize a set of team process outcomes, right? But until I identify those process outcomes, I can't put a dollar value on them. So beginning to help people think before they start about what success looks like, I think is going to be another really important aspect of being able to put this instrument to good use. So where do we go from here? What's next? Hopefully this discussion has gotten you sufficiently intrigued that you're interested in filling out the instrument. It doesn't take very long. It's a pretty straightforward Likert scale, so we would expect it would take no more than 10 to 15 minutes. We'd encourage you to give us feedback on the instruments. You can do that either by the open-ended questions. What were we missing? What are the practices you're using that we didn't ask you to talk about? What are the positive outcomes we don't mention? What are the negative outcomes? Right? All of these kinds of things, we'd love to have your feedback based on your experience. You can also contact Christina or I with feedback about the instrument more generally. We'd love to hear from you. Our emails, our LinkedIn, we're all over the place like everyone is these days. So we would encourage you to reach out to us if you have specific suggestions, questions, concerns about the instrument. We'd ask you to share the link with others. Again, in this validation process, the more people who complete the instrument, the more thorough our job of validation will be. So we would love for you to share the link and to encourage other people in your organization who are working with design thinking, people in other organizations, people you may know through meetup groups, whatever, to go ahead and share with us their personal experiences. And then finally, we've talked with Mariano about coming back to you with some of what we learn in this information that that you're sharing with us. So we will leave the link live for about 2 weeks, and we'll remind you when we're closing it down in the hope that we can get as many responses as possible during that 2-week period. Then when we shut it down, Christine and I will begin our analysis of the information we've gathered so that we can come back to you with some outcomes that we've identified based on the information you've given us.
Yeah, so in sometime in May, I think it is, we have another session, so you can bring back your questions that we didn't answer, and we have another round of presentation and Q&A with these two fine ladies. So Jeanne, we're almost wrapping up. Anything that you want? I mean, so you have something to show in terms of.
That's right. Thank you, Mariano. This is why I'm an academic and a very bad salesperson. This is the opportunity to talk a little bit about, for those of you who'd like to learn a more in-depth process or are trying to make a case in your organization for bringing one in. Here at Darden, we've created an online certificate program. It's a series of courses in design thinking. You can take just one course. For instance, we'll soon be starting an 8-week design thinking workshop course that will allow you to learn the principles of design thinking while you work on a project of your own choosing in your organization. So we'd encourage those of you who are interested in learning more, experiencing this tool, seeing if it might be one way to up the competency level and the quality of the design thinking work that's going on in your organization. We'd love to continue this conversation with you.
So everybody, thanks for your time. Please spread the word with other design thinking practitioners, both experts and rookies. The idea is to have as many inputs for Christina's and Jeanne's research. Stay tuned for more information. And when it comes to Mural, also we also did our own ROI analysis. In particular case with Forrester on IBM, and how doing collaboration remotely on design thinking, at least some part of design thinking, of course, prototypes and testing sometimes need to get done in person, has accelerated the velocity of going to market and shrunk, of course, some costs. So I also recommend you guys go to mural.co/impact for another thorough analysis on ROI. So thanks for joining, and see you soon in a month and a half or so. Cheers.
Bye.
Please email us your feedback about the instrument. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Need it. Thank you.
Thank you.